Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the various news items we have for you this week, the second participant in the PRIME or Neuralink study has had their implant proceeded with. An American dies from Eastern equine encephalitis virus. The idea that activists, and particularly anti-genetic engineering activists, are basically engaging in weaponised incompetency. Australia experiences a heatwave in the middle of winter. A young boy experiences what is likely to be a very nasty thrashing at home after destroying a 3,500-year-old jar in a museum. Idiotic ideas that reading Lord of the Rings in 1984 could turn you into a far-right activist and extremist. SpaceX is to take over the first ever civilian spacewalk, and in doing so, create a record. And at the same time, NASA's also looking to rescue the stranded but not stranded astronauts at long last. But it will be quite a while yet. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Starting with what is effectively a first of kind, it's the PRIME study. The PRIME study is the Neuralink clinical trials. So far we've had one individual receive it, and now there's a second. The key thing here is that because this is such a delicate procedure, and if something goes wrong, things will go very wrong, there's been a lot of care and attention given to going very gradually through the necessary requirements. In this case, however, what's happening is that an individual with quadriplegia, or all four limbs are paralysed, is now receiving it. And that's the next major step. One of the things Neuralink was trying to advertise itself as being able to do, and that is return mobility to individuals who fundamentally have limited or nearly no mobility. Like all good gamers, the first thing the individual did after their neural implant was made was go off and play video games, and also learn how to use computer-assisted design software. But primarily, it was video games, which of course is exactly what you should be doing, and in this case it's actually true. One of the things video games will help with is getting your brain to sync properly with the device. Part of that being hand-eye coordination. Despite how impressive this is, and to be clear, it is impressive, we do need to clearly state that this is only the second individual in the trial, and as such, a mileage will and likely is going to vary significantly. In similar news, we have a study of 20 individuals in the USA who have received uterus transplants. It is noteworthy that only 14 of these 20 individuals actually went on to have a live birth, which does indicate one of two things. Either there's a 30% failure rate for some reason, or the issues around fertility were significantly more than just a uterus issue. Nonetheless, this does raise a, arguably somewhat controversial, but rather important idea with organ transplant. That is, it's more than your liver, your heart, lungs, your irises, and so on. There are plenty of other things in your body that, at first glance, may not seem all that useful to someone else. But as can be shown with this, there is in fact plenty of other things that could be used, to put it rather delicately. There is also another part to this that is also controversial and arguably a massive grey area. Just about every one of the uteruses that were transplanted is only, let's say, held on to until the pregnancy, or the subsequent pregnancies as desired, are completed. Then it is removed. Now, as crass as it may sound, it could be viewed as being something like interchangeable parts. If one individual is no longer wanting to hold on to it, there is a case to be made, is it possible to then transplant it a second time? But of course the article doesn't touch on that, but it's still a point to be made, simply because most of these instances, it's not a permanent transplant. In other interesting news, let's say, regarding diseases, this time rather than prostheses or arguably transplants, we have rare and exotic diseases. Well, not so much rare, but at least in this instance, very unusual. In New Hampshire, a man died after getting the Eastern equine encephalitis virus. The reason this is rare is for several reasons, one of which is simply the conditions required to be infected don't occur all that often. But when they do occur, there is a certain amount of risk. In this case, there were 3 infections, although only one of the people who died is known, there was a second, What makes it a rare infection and effectively disease is that you need mosquitoes to be the vector. Mosquitoes themselves require certain conditions to be able to not only breed, but also to be able to transmit the virus. Sometimes you have one or the other, but not necessarily both together. When it does occur, there are naturally concerns, and this is one reason why the government in the area has decided to try and put curfews in place closer in public areas and so on. But the reason people have died in this instance is largely down to age. As cynical as it is, the older someone is, the more likely they are to die. Well, to be clear about it, the older someone is, the more soon they're going to die. Everybody dies eventually. But in this case, the key thing here is that the age played a major factor in why they died. A lower body functions, the less ability to deal with the stress of infection, and so on. So all of those are a concern. But the other concern, though, is not only do you have an old person dying, but even if you're not an old person, about 30% of individuals will die. And a significant portion of those who survive will have complications, and they'll require physical or mental support. So this is not a minor issue. This will be a fairly significant problem if it continues. The if being a major thing here. Now on to far more interesting news, at least if you like your cheese. And that's just about every cheese, or every hard cheese in the USA, is made using genetic engineering. Now, you might be surprised and you're thinking, no, cows aren't genetically engineered. But it's not the cows themselves that are engineered. Rather, it's the rennet that is produced using genetically engineered bacteria. So rather than relying on baby calves, or calves in general perhaps, or certain plants that can produce rennet, they've simply modified bacteria to produce it en masse, and because of this, most hard cheese in America is made using genetically modified organisms. As said, bacteria. Now, it's not to say you can't get calf-based or cow-based rennet, but it's much more rare. The other option is something like plants, but again, not as reliable. But the production of it via microbial organisms, very efficient and much cheaper, and as such, it became the obvious choice for most cheese making. That means the genetically modified version of rennet that's used for this is actually arguably only slightly inferior, and it's only because rather than using all of the cow or the calf, you're instead using all of it bar the stomach. But at the same time, you do make significant savings, and this is where criticisms about the use of a GMO or GE technology is kind of ridiculous. It is functionally equivalent, just as effective, cheaper, and doesn't involve the killing of baby cows. Most people would consider that an all-round win. Further to that, strictly speaking, you're not actually consuming a genetically modified organism. What you're consuming is a product of a genetically modified organism. The same way those who have diabetes and use insulin are consuming the product of a genetically modified organism. The complaints around genetic modification and genetic engineering technology are actually the same arguments that come up a lot with regards to, for example, glyphosate. And this is the next article we want to touch on. Fundamentally, the issue here is that a lot of the arguments are fundamentally weaponizing really bad research. And it's not just bad research. It's often not even original research. It's things like review articles that try and claim when you bring all this data together in this way, suddenly you have a bad picture. And if you're looking at it without knowing anything else, you might well agree. The problem is that oftentimes there's a lot of data missing somehow, or alternatively, it's not presented in the way it's actually written. And as such, it creates a problem. More so when a lot of this information is reasonably readily available and pretty well known, so there's no reason why it wouldn't be included. And certainly not included in a way that's distorted. But that's what we see, for example, with the IARC report into glyphosate, or the recent American Pediatrics Association article with regards to genetically modified organisms and glyphosate. Both of these are perfect examples of weaponized incompetence. The Genetic Literacy Project provides a really good summary of the key issues in the IARC report in particular, showing that not only is a lot of, claims about the IARC report questionable, but that a lot of what they've done for that is even more questionable, and arguably an attempt to retroactively justify the decisions that they've made, such as including glyphosate in a pesticide study, understanding glyphosate is a herbicide. Shifting to other nature-related news, which rather than arguably man-made destruction of nature, we instead have what is possibly a good thing we're doing, and it's a plastic that will self-destruct once under the right conditions. Now, to be clear about it, the researchers are putting the product forward as a novel way to break down plastics, and they're hoping that it is somewhere within a month, so about 30 days. But that's under the same conditions when they're comparing it to a real plastic, and real plastic in terms of something more commonly available, which take up to 60 days or thereabouts to break down. Something that doesn't happen in nature. In nature, a lot of plastics take far longer than that. So clearly the study is being very optimistic in what it's considering a good experimental setup. The simplified version of what they're doing is that they include certain spores of bacteria within the plastic. As the plastic begins to break down, the spores are exposed to the environment, and because of this they become active again. The bacteria within those spores are key, however, because they're not just bacteria. They're bacteria that make a certain enzyme that will break down the plastic, and that's the key thing here. By having the living bacterial spore in there that gets activated under the right conditions, the plastic breaks down much quicker. But the other thing here is that we're now introducing what could be best described as genetically modified bacteria into nature that are well bred, or at least well designed, to start breaking down certain structures. Some of these being more relevant than others to nature, and some of them not being relevant at all. For example, PBS, or polybutylene succinate, or PBAT, polybutylene adaptate co-tetraphthalate, or PLA, polylactic acid. Some of these are seen in nature to an extent, or at least similar enough compounds, others not at all. And therein lies the key here. By doing this, we could theoretically improve the turnover of plastic in nature, which would be beneficial, or we might well be creating a huge problem for our own future. In similar news, we now have nature and particularly Australia. And it's not so much Australia trying to kill Australians, not yet anyway. Noting that although Australia is currently in the middle of winter, there is a heat wave going on. Understand, compared to other parts of the world where 30 degrees is considered a heat wave, this was closer to 40 degrees Celsius, somewhere between 38 and 40 degrees on Saturday. That's 16 degrees above the average temperature, although that is only in one state, out of about 7. The concern in Australia, at least, on top of the fact that, well, heat wave and therefore unpredictable weather, is what happens come fire season. At the moment, it's looking like the conditions are set up just right, that hot winds, a lack of rainfall, and the warm temperature will lead to a very dry environment, meaning lots of nice hot grass that will catch fire at the slightest possible touch, whether that's somebody throwing away a cigarette, lightning strike, or some idiot with a box of matches. But no matter how it happens, it's a problem, and given how widespread this heatwave has been, yeah, Australia might be in for another hot year, and hot in more ways than just the temperature of the weather. Mother Nature is clearly stepping up their game in an effort to destroy humanity in Australia, given that the Australians, the wildlife, the flora, and just about anything else hasn't been able to so far. And going from what is going to be somewhat disappointing news to what is kind of funny news, and it's more a article talking about the fertility rate with regards to the Manhattan Project. It was a complaint by the medical director, Stafford Warren, to General Leslie Groves, talking about how about 20% of the married women on the Manhattan Project, or at least related to it, were pregnant. Basically, all the scientists, technicians, and so on involved in it were getting frisky, let's say, and apparently the US Army was not very happy about it. Back to news that might have you reliving traumatic experiences from your childhood. In a visit to the Heck Museum at the University of Haifa in Israel, a young boy managed to destroy a Bronze Age jar. Understand that the jar survived 3,500 years without humanity getting involved, but just 35 years at the museum. What is weirder is that there is no punishment to the child for this. It was viewed as an accident and understandable, and as such, the museum has decided to just let it go. In fact, they've even gone so far as to invite the family and child back again. If we were betting people, we'd have said that there was some sort of conspiracy at play. But according to the next piece of research, that may not be the case. There is a publication called Looking Under the Tinfoil Hat, ironically enough, and it found that there are personality and psychopathological correlates for believing in conspiracy theories. Something that really isn't that surprising. It takes a certain amount of, let's presume arrogance is the right word, to establish that you know better than anybody else possibly could. But more than that your half an hour, maybe at most a few weeks on Google has been able to overcome years and possibly decades of research into a given field. Or that, somehow or other, despite the prestige and all the else that would go with it, that some scientist somewhere is hiding the cure to cancer, or whichever other conspiracy theory you particularly prefer. So, no, this isn't all that surprising. It's just nice to have some numbers attached to it. In similar sorts of news, we have the idea that reading Lord of the Rings in 1984 could cause you to become a right-wing extremist, or at least the government report warns us. Now, for some people this is just going to become a reading list, which is perfectly fair. Tolkien's works are not right-wing, and 1984 certainly is not. Surely in this instance, somebody has to be overselling things, but it wouldn't be that surprising to find otherwise. In just as crazy news, but this time, more that somebody's failed to actually understand what they're writing about, it claims that Ukraine has shot down a hypersonic missile, which travels at 10 times the speed of light. The speed of light is basically unachievable as it is, let alone at 10 times the speed of light. Now, presumably somebody screwed up and misspelled speed of sound. But, assuming that that's not what they meant, presumably in Soviet Russia, you launch missile silo, not missile. But the key thing here is that it's supposed to rely on US defense technology, such as anti-missile systems and similar. But also that apparently Russia's technology, not so useful. In technological news that is going to be somewhat useful, especially if you have money to burn, SpaceX is going to be providing a civilian spacewalk at long last. This is distinct from time in space, which Bezos was one of the first to do. Instead, it is actually going out of the spaceship and spending time in the cold, hard vacuum of space, and hopefully returning to Earth, but more on that shortly. The major thing here is the investment to be able to do this. At least one of the individuals involved has invested over $200 million into it, and all of that to spend about 20 minutes outside their spacecraft, roughly 600 kilometers above Earth's surface, or about 400 miles. Because the risk of falling is not good enough. They need to fall from space. That's enough Tim Curry mockery. We have the actual mockery we should have for NASA now. NASA that insisted, and arguably continues to insist, that its 2 astronauts are not stranded in space. The same astronauts who were meant to be there for about a week, and will now have to stay 6 more months after Boeing has been found unable to rescue them. Yes, that is the general definition of stranded. They can't come back home. But NASA says they're not, so guess we'll take their word for it. The key thing here is that they have to return on a SpaceX flight, and the problem is that they weren't really planning on one for quite a while yet. This brings the astronauts' stay on the ISS to 8 months rather than 8 days. And not just that, but we now need to be concerned about any of the possible health risks that may be associated with this. It's already a concern that they're going to be there longer than planned. but at least they get to stay for a very nice holiday in one of the most scenic places in the world. Or perhaps that's out of the world. The reason for the delay, though, does come down to a simple factor of safety. NASA, Boeing, and even SpaceX are not willing to run the risk of returning them to Earth with a vehicle, let's say, that is questionable. That's why SpaceX will do this, but it won't be until February, and it's why Boeing will return the Starliner to Earth, but uncrewed, and hope to be able to salvage whatever data they can from it. In other NASA-related news, we have an update on the consequences of NASA trying to deflect asteroids that were coming towards Earth. It's the 2022 project, let's call it, called the Double Asteroid Redirect Test, which collided Dimorphos, a small moonlet orbiting the larger asteroid Didymos, in order to fundamentally prevent it getting near Earth, which is all well and good, at least in theory, especially if we have to worry about something getting near Earth. For example, the arachnids trying to send asteroids, or meteorites at that point. But the problem we have now is that there's now material or debris from said collision coming towards Earth. They didn't think this through very well, did they? The idea was to stop this from happening, not make more but small things hit Earth. The upside, though, is that because they are smaller, they will burn up in the atmosphere, so as tongue-in-cheek as it is to say that they've completely done the opposite, they have achieved the primary goal. That is, prevent something large enough from getting through the atmosphere and actually hitting Earth in a reasonably solid state. Finally, we have bad news for any academic out there, or at least any scientist out there. A newly created AI scientist is about to start publishing. This is also a problem, and not just because, well, AI is taking away our jobs, thank you South Park, but also that, well, it's actually doing what a, arguably, most likely a postdoc or PhD student will spend their entire time doing. So now they literally have taken our jobs. The idea is to try and automate as much of it as possible, and that's pretty much what they have managed to do to an extent. Understand, again, like previous weeks, this is not true AI. This is machine learning. Admittedly, a very well-developed machine learning algorithm, but nonetheless, machine learning. By itself, that's not particularly good, but it does get worse in terms of news for academics, but particularly either postdocs or PhDs, who don't run their own lab just yet. And even if you do run your own lab, the cost of using this per paper is going to be somewhere around $15. So it's not going to cost much more than a reasonably modest lunch, particularly if you're buying it out. On that basis, it's much cheaper to use this than it is to have a student or a postdoc do the work for you. The article from the conversation not only identifies the fact that it's somewhat problematic that it's going to be basically cheap and accessible, but they raise some arguments that we very much disagree with. One of the major points they're arguing is that, is it interesting and scientists don't want to be told what they already know? Both of these are not necessarily true. First of all, some of the most boring things in the world can be some of the most important. The other thing to note is that a lot of the time, you need to couch your research in such a way that you are building up to what is new, which means you need to tell your reader what is already known. Ideally not in a way that bores them senseless and makes them want to blow their brains out, but enough so that they're not required to have absolutely explicit and complete knowledge of everything in the field. Fundamentally, do they know enough from what you've told them to understand the where, what, why, how, and when of your particular topic that you're going to introduce as the key point of that publication? The issue we have with it is more, and it does come down, at least in part, to finances. One of which is it does deprive students of the ability to develop and grow their writing style. But more than that, it creates a paper mill of sorts. That is something you can pay a small amount of money for and get a relatively crappy article out of, and then submit it to very crappy journals. And this would, if abused correctly, lead to those journals becoming something of a backwater of publishing. That is, they publish legitimate articles, but those legitimate articles are so terrible that unless you're really desperate, you won't go there. One point we do definitely agree with, and that is Because all of these systems are built on the existing literature, the more AI-derived literature that gets put into that system, the more AI learns from itself, the more stagnated it becomes, and as a result, the entire system will eventually fall down like a house of cards, simply because the basis on which it's built doesn't move forwards. And because it's not moving forward, finding new and innovative things, it just keeps producing the same results and same research. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below